Hello, everyone. In today's episode, we're going to talk about QuickBooks Enterprise and item setup. So what we'll cover the item types available in QuickBooks Enterprise. We'll go over adding item details, account mapping and the importance of that, and then we'll show you some examples of each. So let's get started. So I do want to make a note, if we do have time after the presentation, I will answer some questions. If we run out of time, I will get back to each one of you. So QuickBooks and why do we need items and what's the importance of them? So we can use items to simplify entry. People don't always remember a GL account name to post to all the time, but we can always remember the item name, okay? Using items allow us to push data to the same GL account code, but also we can run subledger reports to get more details. They allow us to keep the chart of accounts clean and short. Also to note, sales transactions are item-based and do require items. So what I want to walk through for you is showing you the available types within QuickBooks. So if I come down to, I am on the item list and I want to create a new item. These are available items for us, okay? Each item will need to have a type associated with it. It sets the stage for what the current profile will be used with inside of QuickBooks for that respective item. So what types do we have? We have service, inventory, assembly, non-inventory, other charge, subtotal, group, discount, and payment types of items that we can create in QuickBooks. So service, okay, service type. So we generally use this service type related to service-related charges. This can be included on purchase transactions as well as customer-related transactions. One example would be to use a service type for payroll labor, as I can use this service item and have it be added on to a time card, and thus this can be used in the tracking of job costing on our job profitability reports, as well as it can be added on to a bill for subcontractors for same job costing reports. Our next type is inventory. As the name indicates, this is used for goods we buy and hold into inventory until sold to the end user. We can track quantities on hand and sold with this type of item. Using an inventory type will also allow QuickBooks to post to respective GL accounts when the item is sold. It will make entries for us to our financials, thus reducing the manual effort of making a journal entry to reduce the inventory asset account and posting costs to our COGS accounts and revenue accounts. Inventory assemblies. Similar to the inventory type, however, one big difference is this would be used in the manufacturing process. We can use assigned respective components and quantity of components to a bill of material. The bill of material components are added to what I call the recipe card of the assembly to build one unit of this assembly item. Non-inventory parts. These could be used to track items we buy for office supplies or materials for jobs that we do not track quantity on hand for. And then it would get posted to cost of goods at the time of purchase. Other charge. This could be used for miscellaneous charges such as freight or delivery fees. We use this type of item for setting up the landed cost feature inside of QuickBooks. Subtotals. This is a special type that can be used on transactions where we can use it to total either a single line or total a group of lines within this invoice, and we can have it calculate that total based on amount, dollar amount, or quantity, or price or cost. This is super handy if we are applying discounts to sales transactions on a group of items. Then we have groups. This type of item is used to group multiple items together and sell as a single unit to the end customer. Sometimes I refer to these as gift baskets. So they do have pros and cons to using this group item. So what I want to talk about here are some of the differences between assemblies and groups, okay? So groups do not require a bill of material, so you do not need to do another transaction to manufacture that within QuickBooks, versus assemblies do require a bill of material to be completed within QuickBooks. One thing to note is the difference between groups and assemblies is the reporting that you're going to get out of it. Assembly items can go on to, say, an inventory or a sales report and show you the data on that specific inventory, quantity sold, quantity manufactured. But versus a group, all you're going to see are the component levels, the items that make up this group, and that's what's going to be reflected on your inventory and sales reports is what you're going to see, not the group item itself. Also, the general ledger can be impacted by using a group item versus an assembly. So the group item and how it impacts the financials, the ledger accounts, is going to be based on your individual items that you put in this group, versus the assembly, it affects the GL balances based on that inventory assembly item that it all points to. A couple other things is groups. They only contain name, description, and a custom field within here. So there's not much to be set up. Our next type is discounts. This is used to you can apply a fixed or a percentage amount to a sales transaction based on the line item above it. So it usually looks at the line item right directly above it to give that discount on price or on a percentage on that sales transaction. A lot of times we do use this in conjunction with the subtotal item. One thing that I do want to note is that we do suggest not using this discount item if you do offer early paid discounts to your customers. This would be normally where a special terms would be applied to that sales transaction. Then we have payment types. These can be used to reflect, say, a partial payment on an invoice that can be recorded directly to either undeposited funds account if you're using that, or directly to a bank account, and you can choose your bank accounts from there. This is the option if you are using this partial payment to bypass the received payment transaction type. I would like to kind of put a caution on here that I don't want us to get confused between this payment type of item and if we use prepayments or customer deposits. So those are two totally different workflows. If you are interested more in our workflows on prepayments, you can check out some of our other webinar videos online. So those are our item types available in QuickBooks Enterprise. So let me show you a couple of examples, okay? Starting with our service item. So I created some examples here for you, okay? So what do we need on our items to be created? Well, we will need a name for our item. It's our unique identifier that categorizes our items that we sell and purchase. This is what will get displayed on our invoices or on our purchase order types of transactions. It can have letters, it can have names, it can have a combination of the two. What I would suggest if we are creating some names in QuickBooks, that we create a systematic naming list and that we also keep it consistent throughout the name item list as well. Just to make it easier for the whole team to know where everything is at. Also, with the names, they cannot be duplicate names within Enterprise. They each have to be some unique variable of that name. Another thing to know, if you are using a numbering convention in QuickBooks, QuickBooks will not remember that next consecutive number, item number, that would need to be used if a new item was to be set up. You would have to remember what that numbering convention was. What QuickBooks does allow is the use of sub-items. So I can use a header or parent and child relationships. If we are looking to group similar items together and using sub-items as maybe our various sizes of that products we may purchase and sell, this is a great way to categorize your item list. There is one thing to note though, if you are using a sub-item and a parent relationship, the parent item, this main group item, will also appear on your sales transactions. Then we have categories. Categories is relatively new. It's been out within the last couple of years. We will touch base a little more in detail on this in a follow-up webinar. What we can also indicate on a item card is our units of measure. So in QuickBooks, there is an option to have no units of measure. We can enable it to have single units of measure, or as well as multiple units of measure. So I can assign each item its respective units of measure. Setting up the units of measure in QuickBooks, we can do multiple units of measure, and we can have QuickBooks do some conversions for us. So if set up correctly, we can use the quantities for your base units of measure on the items, and then we can have different units of measure on maybe our purchasing transactions, and QuickBooks can do the conversion of the counts on hand for us. This topic, though, does require a little bit more in-depth. I'm not going to cover that too much in this episode. That could be coming in some future episodes that we talk more in depth on units of measure and multiple units of measure. Now, you may have heard of some items being called double-sided items. And to enable this feature in QuickBooks, we're going to toggle this button on here. So I can toggle this on and off. And once it is on, we call this a double-sided item, meaning I can use this item on purchase transactions that can hit one account, and I can use it on sales transactions that can hit another respective account. This is very convenient, so you can track both sides of the reports and not have to create multiple GL accounts onto your chart of accounts, keeping it nice and clean. Also super important is that if we are using service or non-inventory types of items on an assembly as part of our components, you will have to enable this feature to be able to use this item as such on that recipe card for that assembly. One thing to note is this feature to enable this double-sided feature is available on only the service, non-inventory, and other charge type of items. Inventory and assembly types are automatically double-sided items. So what else do we have in here? Other features that we can add are purchase information and sales information. So our description field, This area is where you can add as much or as little information about the item. And it can be filled in with the purchasing and have it go onto the purchase order side, as well as it can be the same or it can be different for a description that goes onto an invoice or a sales transaction. Utilizing these fields can help make our lives a little more efficient by auto-populating this description information onto transactions for us. The next field that I want to talk about is the cost field of an item. The cost field is very important to have filled out. Many a times I see it leave at 0, and I always say put at least $1 in there for a few reasons. So the cost field is tracked for many different areas within QuickBooks. So it can be used as a default cost on purchase transactions, okay, like inventory. We can know what our standard cost is or our current cost is on that inventory item, okay? We can also use it on our services for paying subcontractors and our labor. We know what our standard cost is on that item. So the other places that the cost field will be used within QuickBooks is on a purchase order. Once an item is placed on a purchase order, it will use this default cost field to populate on there for us. This would be good for purchasing management to kind of review and confirm current prices are reflected on our item profile cards within QuickBooks. If not, they may need to review our item costs set in QuickBooks and may need to update them accordingly. This field is also used on the assembly as well as for the components. This is used to create the fully final cost of the assembly. So if cost is reflected, the cost is reflected in the component, and if it is incorrect on our item card, say with a 0 cost, that will also translate to our assembly cost as well, reflecting an inaccurate cost on our assembly. So super important, especially if we are using service or non-inventory items within our assembly recipe. So we want to make sure that we have some kind of average or stated cost on these cards so it can flow through to our assembly cost as well. Other areas that the cost field is looked at within QuickBooks is at price levels. If you're using price levels feature in QuickBooks and base your special pricing for customers to calculate calculate the sales price based on a cost, this is the field where QuickBooks will default to. Estimates as well. Estimates will default using this cost and placing that on our estimate transaction. Sales price. Adding the correct sales price onto our items is super important as well, as it will flow through onto our sales transactions. This will assist to ensure we have correct pricing that goes onto our invoices and sales orders. It can also aid in sales management to ensure we have the correct margins you are expecting to achieve on our sales, the sales of your products. As well, going back to price levels and advanced pricing feature within QuickBooks, it will default to this sales field, the sales price field, to calculate those special pricings for our invoices if you are using it for price levels and advanced pricing. One thing we'll talk about in a little bit is our account mapping. But first I want to touch over on preferred vendors. So there are fields that we can add a preferred vendor onto our item cards. This is super handy field to populate. Adding a preferred vendor into this field for the respective item can be helpful when someone needs to create, say, a purchase order. They'll know which vendor to use. Also, it is used when using the auto create purchase order feature in QuickBooks. And then you may ask yourself, if it's a service item, why do I need a preferred vendor field on a service item? Well, nice thing that you can do, you can put this service item or non-inventory item onto a purchase order. Thus, you can use it to lock in any special pricing that you may have with that vendor for the goods and services you are going to be receiving. So that's the basic setup for our service and our non-inventory items. What I want to touch base on is some of our inventory types. So here is our inventory type item profile. Okay, similar information that we can add as the service item type that I just went over. What I want to talk about here is our account mapping. Okay, using the correct GL account mapping is super important in QuickBooks. So we have the correct mapping will provide more accurate financials and reports for us to make better business decisions now and in the future. Having even one item incorrectly mapped to any one of these fields, the COGS, income, or asset, can skew our profit and loss and our balance sheet reports. We always suggest as part of a month-end process to regularly check and review item mapping, especially in inventory and assembly items. The COGS account. For inventory and assembly items, this is the account QuickBooks will use once the item is placed onto an invoice. It will post automatically to this cost of goods account, thus being reflected onto your profit and loss. For the service or non-inventory items we just went through, instead it's going to say expense account instead of the COGS account. It does the same exact function. Okay, so for those, the expense account, that's where you will see it being used and posted to your profit and loss based if you put it on an item receipt, a bill, or a check, or maybe a credit card type of transaction. What's also important on this, if a service or non-inventory item is used on an assembly as a component, it will defer to this COGS or expense account to post that credit to on your financial once that build assembly has been created within QuickBooks. The income account, similar to the COGS field, when the item is added to a sales transaction, QuickBooks will defer to this field as to where to place the revenue dollars to your financials. If mapped incorrectly, and I have seen it, this could have unfavorable reflection on your profit and loss. One thing to note in QuickBooks, it does require an account in this field anytime you're setting up a new item. I always suggest to use an income account in this field, even if you may not have the intention of selling this item or putting it on an invoice. But if there is ever that slightest chance that it may happen, at least you know you will capture those revenue dollars on your profit and loss if it is mapped correctly. The asset account. The asset applies to inventory and assembly type of items only. This is very important to map correctly to the correct GL account so it can post to the respective balance sheet account, inventory balance sheet account. Also, QuickBooks will defer to this for the finished assembly item after the build assembly has been completed. So it's going to look not only on your inventory part when you purchase the raw material, but it'll look at the inventory asset account on the assembly, where to place it on your balance sheet in its correct and respective asset account. Okay. The other thing that we have on inventory parts and assemblies is this reorder point. So we can set min and max. So minimum and maximum quantity we want on hand. So these are super valuable options to add within your inventory items and assembly items. These can be used to control the minimum quantity you want to keep on hand for a respective item, as well as a maximum amount you want to keep on hand for that same item. This is super handy when we're also utilizing that auto purchase order create fee option within QuickBooks. So what I want to touch on next is our inventory assemblies. So coming into here, we have a lot of the same fields as our service and our inventory items. So it's kind of similar in that aspect, but there is one big difference here. We need to add the components that make up one single unit of a build assembly. So you can see a couple of items listed here, and I can add more if I need to. But there's also this full view button that's going to show the complete recipe, a little bit more real estate that you get to see of items. And it's going to show, as you see, I have a couple items on here, the raw material and the screws, the respective components, and the respective quantity of components that will make up one unit of this build assembly. And as well as you can see that it's defaulting to the inventory item card for this respective item, that cost field. That is how QuickBooks is calculating the cost of this assembly. You can see it down here. One thing that I always like to point out as well, there is this cost field within QuickBooks for the assembly. You have a couple of options. By default, it will use the global preference. So it's going to use the global cost of your items. And you may have costs set at different sites. So if we use the global, it's going to use the average of those. You can have it where you can add in your own defined cost. Keep in mind, you'd have to keep updating this each time costs change. I like the feature of using this total BOM cost. So it's going to use my items that I put on here, defer to the item cost field, and calculate my cost for me. So each time I may need to update a raw material cost, it will flow through onto my assembly. Now, one thing to note, this file is set up for average inventory costing. It will use average cost of those inventory items, but if it is a non-inventory or service item that is part of the components, it will use that stated cost field to calculate the cost of this assembly. A couple other things that we can add onto an item since we're in here. We can add a note, any free-form notes for an item, maybe if it's being discontinued, as well as we can add custom fields onto items. We do have the option of adding up to 13 different custom fields for these items with defined options of using either a date, number, or a drop-down format. So I do want to note in here with custom fields, they are global. So these custom fields will be used across all items on the list. They are not necessary to fill in, but they will be there available for each and every one of our items, as well as custom fields can be used to be included onto our sales and purchasing transactions. Okay, so I know we're almost out of time, so I want to kind of touch base on a couple more items so you can see what those look like. So a non-inventory part, it looks just the same as one of our service items. I'll have the same features available for us, turning it on to being double-sided, as well as our other charge item. Similar information as our service type and our non-inventory type of items. Some of our special inventory or some of our special types of items, subtotals. What we want to add here is the name as how we want it to appear on our sales transaction, as well as adding a description. From here, we're going to choose, do we want it to subtotal the dollar amount or the total quantity on our invoice? And we can have all or one of each or a combination of the 4 available options for us. Groups. So from here, we're going to add the name and the description of the group that we want to have populate onto our invoice. One thing to note on a group is we have a button, print items in group. This enabled, we would be able to have the customer see on their invoice each of the individual components that make up the group. Alternately, if we toggle this off, all they will see is the group name, the quantity of groups they're buying, and then the description. This information of the components will only be on screen for the user to see and not show onto the invoice. Discounts, similar, provide a name and a description for the discount to be reflected on the invoice. We have the option of setting it up as a dollar amount or a percentage of a discount. And then we want to add the respective GL account where we're going to have this dollar amount populate onto our profit and loss. And then we have payments, provide the name and a description. You can also add in the payment method if you so choose. And then the options for here are to include it with our undeposited funds account if you're using that, or alternately have it deposit directly into our bank account, our GL bank account. What this will do, it kind of bypasses the sales receipt type of transaction. So it's kind of wrapping it up. That is some of our items that we can create in here. Let me show you what they look like on an invoice. So within here on this invoice, I have a couple of our inventory items. I included our subtotal so you can see it is subtotaling the quantity lines above. It is totaling our dollars amount above as well. Then with that, I added our 2% discount. This is going to look at our line directly above it to provide our discount. So I grouped everything together. Adding our other charge for freight. Our kit 52 is our group item. And as we can see, our individual components that make up that group. We'll see it on our screen here. We can change the quantity for what we need. And then we have our cash payment and how that looks on our invoice here as well. Okay, so what would the customer see? If I do a preview of this invoice, this is what the customer will see on their side for this invoice. The items, the subtotal, the discount, the freight, and you can see this is our group. It's just showing the group item, none of the components, and then our cash payment. I hope you enjoyed today's session on going through item setup. If there are any questions, I will respond to you directly. Thank you and have a great day.